Hello and welcome to the Unit 2 overview for Metro 101. In Unit 2, we're going to shift gears a little bit with Chen, and we're going to examine what he calls the changing metropolis. We're going to look at the early expansion of cities and how migration and immigration are closely tied to that. And as our cities expand, we'll see how the lives and the experiences and the sense of place vary for different people. As we move through this unit, we're going to take a look at the suburbs and see how the suburbs were originally planned and what the goals were, and how our suburbs provided a great deal of opportunity for some, but were relatively or rather exclusive for others. We'll look to see how our cities changed, particularly in North America and Western Europe after World War II. We'll examine a couple topics like deindustrialization and globalization. And then we'll wrap up Unit 2 by looking at the metropolis as a place of inequality. And throughout Unit 2, we're going to talk about some topics that, while we look at them in a historical lens, we see how they play out today with issues like opportunity and lack of opportunity, discrimination, racism, segregation. So we'll examine the origins of these different social concerns and how a lot of these were rooted in different policies. So we'll start out by looking at Chen's Chapter 5 called Metropolitan Expansion. And we'll look at some of the push and pull factors that attract migrants to our cities. So it's important to recognize that since 1950, our global populations have grown from about 730 million to over 3.5 billion people. So over the last 70 years, we've exceeded 50% of our population living in metropolitan areas. And we'll take a look at the reasons for this change. We'll look at growth in industry, job opportunities, concentration of capital where businesses establish themselves, and also transportation that's connecting cities to our hinterlands, to our other areas, to other opportunities. So we'll look at some of the basics of metro growth, and we'll see how cities in the Western world are growing at a slow pace, and cities in developing countries are growing rapidly. We're seeing a population explosion. In the second half of this chapter, we're going to take an interesting look at human agency and see how in a number of cities, human agents recognized problems and provided solutions through urban planning. We're going to see how individuals like Mulholland was able to introduce a reliable water supply to Southern California. This introduction, this planning of bringing water from Central California into Southern California allowed Los Angeles to experience a population explosion in the 20th century. We'll take a look at how Frederick Law Olmsted helped redesign New York City and introduce Central Park. We'll take a look at LaFont and see how his ideas helped grow and create Washington, D.C. as we know it today. So we'll better understand how human agency ties to urban problems and offering new solutions. In Chapter 6, we're going to jump into the suburbs, and I think you're going to find this look at suburbanization very interesting. While suburbs are relatively new in the urban experience, we're looking at post-World War II as a time when the suburbs really took off. We'll see how an individual named Levitt created the mass production model for growing our suburbs. And we see this today, how we moved from custom-built homes in the suburbs to speculative building. So we have new developments that are popping up all around our cities. If you live in Maryland, you might recognize the expansion of the suburbs. If you live around Washington, D.C., you'll recognize the expansion of the suburbs into Montgomery County, Frederick County, Howard County, Prince George's County, Charles County. If you're living in the Baltimore metro area, you'll recognize the expansion of the suburbs into Harford County and Carroll County. So you'll probably recognize some of these mass production models that were put in place in the mid-1900s. And also very important is the sense of place that the suburbs create. Part of suburbanization was selling this new idea, selling this new lifestyle. And we'll see how different spaces relate it to men and women. We'll see how different groups were able to create a new culture with like-minded or people in a similar life phase. We'll also recognize some of the ugly sides of suburbanization with a number of exclusionary practices. We'll first examine covenants, which were legal agreements among homeowners that they would not sell their house, usually to a minority buyer. The minority could be racial, ethnic, or religious. And then we'll look at redlining. Redlining created a number of issues, a number of social challenges that we're facing today with racism, with discrimination, with segregation. It's really important that we understand redlining so we can understand a lot of the issues that we're going to face here in this decade, in the 2020s. Redlining eliminated generational wealth from a large number of individuals, primarily minorities. Redlining segregated our population. So while the suburbs grew into these white, relatively affluent places, a lot of our cities were trapped in um, the result of redlining, which cut off funding, which cut off investment to minority neighborhoods. So these are really important topics that we need to address, that we need to know more about if we examine what's happening in this decade going forward and how we could be agents of change, how we could provide solutions by understanding some of the roots of the problems. In Chapter 7, we're going to look at the metropolitan landscape after World War II. And a few really important terms are going to pop up here that'll also introduce us to the third unit of this term, deindustrialization and globalization. So we should know by now that our cities grew through industrialization. In North America, beginning in the 19th century, running through most of the 20th century, we saw our urban growth occur simultaneously with industrialization. Well, beginning around 1970, we started to see this trend of deindustrialization. Our cities began to lose heavy industries as businesses took production elsewhere. So cities needed to now recreate themselves, reimagine themselves in this new globalized, deindustrialized world. So as our cities saw industry leave, it was time to shift into other types of economic activity, services for the most part. So we're going to see how this impacted individuals. We're going to see how this impacted the layout of the city, how this helped create the world that we know today. So the post-industrial world is the one that we're most familiar with. And this change has had profound human and political impacts. And in this chapter, we'll also take a look at immigration and how our current waves of immigration differ from those in the past, and how cities like Los Angeles, California, for example, are what's known as polyglot cities, cities of many languages. So in the slides, I include a number of images from the different communities, the different ethnic communities in Los Angeles that reflect this polyglot nature. When we think about diversity, we think about change, we think about the movement of people. We're starting to recognize that in the post-World War II metropolis. And again, we're going to see the emergence of the global economy as we become more interdependent and interconnected with people, places, and institutions around the world. We'll see in particular how a megalopolis area in China is now more connected with the Western markets, particularly the United States. We'll see how our relationship with Mexico has changed and how the growth of cities right across the border is directly related to the emergence of the global economy. The final chapter of this unit shifts us a little bit into what we're going to see in Unit 3, and that looks at more social inequalities. And again, this builds on some of the topics that are introduced with suburbanization. We'll take a deeper look at gender spaces, so how our metropolis in the past and even today reflects gender norms. I want you to think about this when you go to a different shopping center, a different strip mall, a different mall, a different main street. How are we organizing space to attract one gender versus the other? Historically, we had a lot of establishments like bars that would be men only. We would have social clubs that would be women only. We've torn down a lot of those barriers related to gender spaces, but we still see maybe more implicitly how these gender spaces play out in our metropolitan landscapes today. We'll take another look at immigration and stratification. So we'll see how the lives of immigrants changed depending on where they were, how opportunities, how discrimination, how segregation impacted the lives of our immigrants then and now. We'll take a look at the 5 Points neighborhood in Chinatown in New York City and see how the lives of immigrants and first and second generation Americans were profoundly impacted by these places. We'll also take a look at what's known as the Great Migration, which was the movement of African Americans out of the South into our industrial cities. These coincided with World War I and World War II, particularly World War II, when we saw a high demand for labor that we were no longer able to meet with local populations. So we saw the shift of millions of African Americans, again, from the rural South into our industrial cities. Now, this shift helped fill a demand for labor, but what we saw was that tensions arose when outsiders of a different race began to populate different city neighborhoods. So during this time, we saw the establishment of what are known as sundown towns, where African Americans would be permitted to work during the day but must leave at sunset. We also see the enforcement and the establishment of different policies that separate white residents from African American residents. We see the early establishment of ghettos. Remember, a ghetto is somewhere that is an involuntary enclave. So the idea that as African Americans moved into our industrial cities, they were not permitted to enter the free housing market. They were not permitted to go into the suburbs, into the more affluent areas of our cities. So this, again, created some long-term challenges that we're still dealing with today, generations later. And as we go through Unit 2, we're going to touch on some more Clay topics, and I think the Unit 2 topics are easily relatable. Within the lecture slides, I include a number of topics and examples that you might find right here in Towson. Again, we share different homes, but all of us are at least somewhat familiar with Towson, with the university and the surrounding community. We'll look at fronts, and fronts are where different energies converge, and we'll see how the demand for student housing is pushing off campus and into the Towson core. Take a look at a couple development projects, Towson Row, 101 York, and how those areas, how those fronts serve to push the boundaries of the university a little farther out. We'll take a look at strips, and I think one of the really interesting aspects of Clay's strips concept is that when you look at a strip, it tells us a lot about who we are. So I think as you look at your next field report, the idea that a strip tells a lot about your community is something really interesting, something I think you could take hold of. We are in the summertime. We see summer traffic lead to beats. In the wintertime, in the fall, we see Thanksgiving travel is another beat. So this idea of beat, this predictable mass movement of people, and it's a good way to understand how we use our cities and our metropolitan spaces. So we can look at these different beats throughout an annual calendar. We can also look at them throughout the day. Clay uses a really creative term, a really creative idea of a city inhaling and exhaling. So the movement of the population into the city for work during the day and then leaving at night, this inhale, exhale of people, reflects his idea of what he calls a beat. And then we'll wrap up with stacks. And stacks I have here out of sight and in plain view. The idea that our boom towns, our construction sites, our sources of energy create these areas of material. I think once you read a little bit more about stacks, you're going to start to recognize the existence and persistence of stacks in your community. So again, I think Clay Unit 2 really puts together some creative concepts in terms that you'll easily be able to identify within your own communities. So as you move through, let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, I'll talk to you soon.